Welcome to Chapter 4 of Matrix Games World in Flames training video. The topic of this chapter is sequence of play. What you're looking at is the second page of the 10th tutorial. This gives an overview of the sequence of play. There are a few phases related to just the new game, and then you get into a new turn. Within a turn there are a series of impulses. Each impulse consists of the following stages. There's the naval air assignments, naval movement, naval combat, some independent air missions, then land movement and combat, some air rebase, and then reorganization, where some of the units that were disorganized during the impulse have an opportunity to become reorganized. There's a check to see if this is the end of the turn or not. If it's not, then we go back and repeat for a second impulse. There can be few, like 3 or 4 impulses, or there can be a lot, like 11, 12, 14, 15 impulses within a game turn. Each game turn consists of 2 months. At the start of global war, the first turn is September-October 1939. The second turn is November-December 1939. And the third turn is January-February 1940. Depending on the weather and the weather rolls, you could have a lot of impulses or few. When the weather is bad, like in January, February, there might only be 3 or 4 impulses in a turn. But in the summer months, July, August, there could be 14 or 15 impulses within a turn. Each side is the phasing side for an impulse. So if the axis were the phasing side for the first impulse, they would go through and move their naval units, their land units, and initiate combat. At the end of the impulse, the side would change and the allied player would become the phasing side. They would go through moving their units, and so on. Eventually, the turn will end, and there are a number of end-of-turn activities. The way World in Flames is set up is there are some things that occur at the beginning of a turn, others that occur at the end of the turn. There are some tasks that are performed at the beginning and the end of an impulse, but the meat of the game consists of this sequence of events where you move your units and engage in combat. The start of the game just has 3 phases. There's the possibility of lend-leasing air units between major powers on the same side. You have the opportunity to scrap older and obsolete units. Both of these change what units are in your force pool. When it comes time to randomly select units for setup, if you've lend-leased units and scrapped units well, you'll have a better set of units from which to randomly choose. Here are the phases for a new turn. Mostly it's reinforcements. Reinforcements has a set of 6 subphases. You get some annual additions in the January-February turn. You also have the opportunity to scrap older units. Replacement naval units only occurs a few times late in the game. Assigning pilots to reserve air units is fairly important. You might have 4 or 5 air units and only 2 or 3 pilots, so you choose which air units get the pilots. You then place your units on the board. And finally, you may want to take some of the older air units, which have pilots assigned already, and remove them from the board. That frees up a pilot so that the next turn you'll have another pilot available for perhaps an air unit that's coming in as a reinforcement. Trade agreements are mostly set by the game at the beginning, and they were historically what the political trade agreements were. The United States and Japan, for instance, had a trade agreement to send each other resources and build points. That trade agreement became less and less over time, leading up to Pearl Harbor. The initiative is when you decide which player is going to be the phasing side on the first impulse. You might be able to re-roll for getting to choose that, getting to make that decision. But eventually someone wins the initiative and they decide which side goes first. So a new impulse, every new impulse, is going to go through the set of weather, declare war, and choosing an action. The weather only happens on odd impulses, so the first, the third, the fifth, the seventh, and so on. The reason the weather only changes every other impulse is so that the weather will be identical for the first and second impulses, which means that both sides will have identical weather for when they are the phasing side. Declaring war is very important. It doesn't happen all that often, but when it does, it's a big event. You first decide which major powers you're going to declare war on, and then you can declare war on minor countries. This subphase of the declare war phase has a number of odd things that can also happen. The U.S. can occupy Greenland and Iceland and Northern Ireland. The USSR might claim Bessarabia, or Hungary and Bulgaria might make their claims upon Romania. Also, the USSR has the opportunity to make claims upon Finland's borderlands. All of these events might cause units to have to be rebased. After the declare war on minors, there are some U.S. entry events that might occur. The U.S. gets upset if the Axis declares war on other countries. There are some neutrality pacts that could be created or renewed. Any countries that were attacked get to call out their reserves, including the minor countries that were attacked. There's also an opportunity for sometimes aligning minor countries to yourself. For instance, Germany gets the opportunity to align Finland, and this helps them when they go to war with the USSR. If minor countries are aligned, then you get to set up their units. The last phase within the new impulse stage is choosing an action, and this is very important. Here's the screen for choosing an action, and this is Germany trying to choose whether to have a naval, air, land, combined, or a pass option. If they take an action that's such as land, Germany will have 4 air missions. They will not be allowed to do any naval moves. They will have 3 rail moves, an unlimited number of land moves and land attacks. This sort of makes sense. If you choose a land action, you don't get to do any navy, and you get a whole lot of land. Conversely, if you do a naval action, you get 2 air missions, an unlimited number of naval moves, but you're not allowed to do anything on land. No rail moves, or land attacks. Air is similar in that it gives you an unlimited number of air actions. Combined as a mixture of the 3, it gives you a lot of air missions. It gives you 1 naval move, use it wisely, 1 rail move, 6 land moves, and 3 land attacks. Pass is when you want to try to get the turn to end and you're praying and hoping that it goes way fast. Passing enables you to increase the probability that the turn will end. Here's a case where Germany is looking at doing a combined action and using an offensive chit. Offensive chits are very expensive to build, cost a lot of build points, but if you have one in your hot little hand, you might want to use it to have a combined action with offensive chit. You'll notice that that gives you an unlimited number of land, air, and naval moves, an unlimited number of land attacks. In other words, you get to shove around every piece that you own on the map. Here's the first of the real stages within an impulse. You do port attacks, or you do naval air missions. Port attacks are an air mission, and the sequence that is shown here is representative of all the air missions. There are 8 different ones, port attacks just being the first one that comes up in the sequence of play. Combat Air Patrol lets you send out some fighters on hexes that you think are going to be attacked. Bomber and air transports and escorts can be sent out by the phasing side, and then the defending player can send out fighter interceptors. The phasing side can send out offensive interceptors to the defensive interceptors, which are intercepting the bombers. Once that sequence has been all established, the air-to-air combat takes place, and assuming that the bombers survive the air-to-air combat, then they're subjected to anti-aircraft combat. The non-phasing side, the defender, can choose which anti-aircraft units to shoot at which airplanes, and they roll for results and assign damage. If the bombers still survive, having gone through air-to-air combat and anti-aircraft, they can perform their mission. In this case, it's a port attack, so they're bombing ships. After they've completed their mission, they return back to base. Naval air missions are much simpler. You just send your air units out into a sea area on patrol. That cannot be interfered with by the non-phasing side, so it goes very quickly. Here's naval movement Naval movement enables you to load your transports within a port and then move your naval units. They might be intercepted by the enemy. If they stay at sea, they could actually pick up a land unit from a coastal hex. So you could either load them in port or you could load them while at sea. And if you continue on to another port, you can then debark your land units. So one of the sequences is you load it in port, you move it, and then you unload it in a new port. Or you leave port empty, get to a new sea area where you pick somebody up, and then later on in a subsequent impulse, return to a port where you can debark it. Naval intercepts may lead to naval combat right in the middle of the naval movement phase. What happens is if the enemy units decide to intercept, they try. They roll a die to see if they can find you. If they don't find you, you just keep moving. If they do find you, then the phasing side with the moving units decides whether they want to just stop in the sea area, end their move for those units right in that sea area, or they could try to fight through. If they fight through, then there's a naval combat. At the end of the naval combat, they get to choose whether they want to stop in the sea area or continue their naval movement. So naval intercepts can intercept all naval moves, not only during the naval movement phase, but at a couple other times in the sequence of play where naval units move. Naval combat is fairly complex. Here's the naval combat preparation sequence. What happens after naval movement is the phasing side gets to initiate naval combats in any sea area where there's units from both sides. After they've chosen all the sea areas and all those combats have occurred, then the non-phasing side gets to do the same thing. But let's just look at the phasing side. They choose where to initiate combat. They fly air units into the sea area. Both the attacking and defending player can do this, both the phasing and non-phasing side. They can beef up how much air power they have in a sea area where combat is about to occur. They also can choose whether their subs are going to be part of the combat or whether they're just going to hide. And then there's a search roll. The purpose of the search roll is to see if the two sides see each other. There's a very good possibility that the search rolls will be high and that there will be no combat. All this other work will have just been wasted. If there is a combat, if there is one side that sees the other or they both see each other, then you go through calculate surprise points. Calculating surprise points occurs if the search numbers are radically different. If one search roll is 10 and the other is 5, then there can be quite a few surprise points available. Depending upon the search rolls and who won surprise, you get to decide which sea boxes are part of this combat. And in fact, the winning side can actually choose, using 4 surprise points, choose which kind of naval combat occurs. Or they could just say, we don't want to have this combat at all. So the phasing side could initiate combat, fly units. The search rolls could be such that the non-phasing side wins. And then when the non-phasing side gets down here to choose combat type, they say, I don't want it. No combat in that sea area. But let's assume that there is a combat. There are 3 kinds of naval combats that can occur, and only one of them will occur at any naval combat round. There's a naval air combat where the planes fly against the ships. There's a surface combat where the ships just fire at each other. The Hood trying to sink the Bismarck is an example of a surface combat. There's a submarine combat, which is usually submarines attacking convoys, or submarines attacking convoys defended by escorts. If you choose a naval air combat, then we're going to go through an entire air combat sequence as we did for the port attacks. There's an opportunity to spend surprise points at that air-to-air combat stage where you can make things better for yourself and increase your air-to-air combat effectiveness. If it's a surface combat, you go straight into firepower effectiveness, same for submarine combat. Once you get into here, there's another opportunity to spend surprise points. You can increase your firepower effectiveness or decrease your opponent's. Once you've done the calculation of how much strength you have and then how many targets there are, you can use the combat tables and you will get a result for how many units are going to be destroyed, damaged, and aborted. The owning player generally gets to choose the target, but again, surprise points enables the enemy to choose the target if you have them to spend. You then roll for your damage. If you were told that it was going to be a destroyed unit, you pick out one of your units, say a battleship, and if you roll well, instead of it being destroyed, it's merely damaged. But if you roll poorly, it will actually be destroyed. Once all the damage results have been assigned, each player gets to choose whether they want to abort or continue the naval combat. If they decide to continue, then we go back to the previous stage, coming in here at flying air units into the sea area and committing subs and search rolls and surprise points and etc. What that means is that when you come back here the second time to the naval air combat surface combat, you can choose again which one of these three to use. So the first round could be naval air, the second round could be submarine, the third could be surface. It doesn't matter. Once naval moves and combats are done, there are a series of independent air missions: strategic bombing, carpet bombing, and ground strikes. All of these use the map, which is what the little yellow hexagon means, is that the decision making is done by the player using the map. The ovals here indicate whether an air action, naval action, land action, or combined action was chosen. And the green A means that you have an unlimited number of strategic bombardments if you chose an air action. For any of the others, N, L, and C, you could do strategic bombardment missions, but you have a limited number. The same is true for carpet bombing and for ground strikes. So if you have 3 air missions, you have to choose which of these you're going to do. You could skip them all and save them for ground support, which comes later, or for paradrops. Or maybe you've used all 3 of them for port attacks and you don't have any of these, and all 3 of these phases will be skipped. You also have the ability to use artillery to bombard as part of ground strikes. That does not consume air missions, obviously. The air-to-air combat sequence is thrown onto this page because there's room for it. Basically, you choose the role for some of your planes. There are fighter bombers, which could go as fighters or bombers, and the carrier air units usually have the capability of being both fighters and bombers, so you choose which role they're going to take. You then arrange your units in 2 rows. You have your fighters and you have your bombers. The fighters that are in front for both sides more or less face off and engage in combat. If any unit has to suffer results, it's usually the front units for both the fighters and the bombers. You roll for results. Here's where the surprise points can be spent. And you assign damage, choosing which unit suffers. Again, surprise points can be used here. Like the naval combat, air-to-air combat can be aborted or continued. There can be multiple rounds for air-to-air combat. If you choose to stay, if both sides choose to stay, then there's definitely going to be another air-to-air combat sequence. That continues until one side runs out of planes or one of the sides decides to call it quits. Strategic bombardment is air missions against factories, oil resources, and saved oil and build points. Carpet bombing are strategic bombing missions, but they're applied against ground units with the hope of actually destroying the ground unit. Ground strikes do not destroy ground units, but they disorganize them. So the purpose behind a ground strike is to weaken the enemy in preparation for land attacks later. Land movement stage has 2 phases: moving your rail units and moving your land units. Again, the ALC refers to air, land, and combined actions. In this case, all 3 of these provide you with a limited number of rail moves. Moving land units can only occur during the land and combined actions. In the land action, you can have an infinite number of land unit moves. In the combined action, you're limited. One of the things that can occur when moving land units is that the USSR might make a claim on eastern Poland or the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The Axis powers might also collapse Vichy France by moving a Axis unit into Vichy France. The other event that occurs during land movements is overruns. An overrun is when armored and mechanized units move into a hex that is occupied by very weak enemy units. If that occurs, then the enemy units are destroyed, and you get a chance to scrap those if there were your units that were destroyed. Otherwise, you might be overrunning like an air unit and forcing it to rebase, or overrunning a naval unit and forcing it to either rebase or perhaps capturing it. The other parts of the land movement stage is air transport, where you pick up some air units and fly them to a different hex. Debarking land units is when you have a land unit on a ship and the ship is out at sea in one of the sea areas. If it's a friendly hex, you can just debark the land unit and have it land into the friendly hex. If it's an enemy hex, then there are restrictions on when you're allowed to place the land unit on the enemy hex. If you meet those requirements, then it's an invasion, and you're actually performing, say, an invasion at Anzio, or an invasion of Sicily, or an invasion of Normandy. In all cases, those are contested, and a combat is going to have to take place. The other thing you can do with air units and transports is to perform a paradrop. So the air transport picks up a paratroop unit and then has it paradrop into an enemy hex. Again, this is going to require a land combat to occur. Note here that air units are infinite for transport, but they're limited for naval, land, and combined. You can have an unlimited number of land units debark from a naval transport if you have a naval or a land action, and a combined action it's limited. In a land action you can have an infinite number of invasions, but in combined it's limited, and likewise for paradrops. Here's land combat, at least the first portion of it. You declare all your land combats first. Once the phasing side has decided where they're attacking, then the non-phasing side gets to decide whether to include a notional unit. Against invasions and paradrops, World in Flames models each hex as having a single defensive point as a notional unit. So even though the hex is empty, there's at least one strength factor contesting your arrival. The defending player at times might want to say that strength point doesn't exist. For instance, if he has other units already in the hex, and for some reason that extra point would be hurtful. You can also assign emergency headquarters supply, which sometimes when you're being attacked means that it'll strengthen your defending units. There's a possibility of having naval units out at sea provide sure bombardment. This is usually battleships and cruisers that do that. Both sides have the option of doing that, assuming that the optional rule has been invoked. Both sides can have their headquarters provide extra support. This causes the headquarters to become disorganized, so it's used carefully. And you can also fly tactical bombers into a hex that is going to be subjected to a land combat. These are called ground support. So if you fly bombers into a combat hex, land combat hex, then an air mission takes place with the entire air mission sequence. Both sides can do this, so you can have bombers from both sides and fighters from both sides and anti-aircraft guns firing from both sides. It can be rather involved. Once all the preparatory work has been done, then you resolve the land attacks one at a time. The phasing player chooses one land attack to resolve and goes through this entire sequence before choosing the next land attack to perform. So, the phasing side selects a land combat. He then chooses which type of combat, whether it's going to be an assault or a blitzkrieg combat. There are several rules related to who gets to make that decision. You roll for the results, which will produce some kind of damage for perhaps both the attacker and the defender, or perhaps for just one side. If units are destroyed, then there's a digression into whether you want to scrap some units. If the defender has been shattered, which means that they are removed from the map and come in as reinforcements in the next turn, The attacker can decide that he doesn't want to shatter the defending units, and instead he would rather have them retreat, have them remain on the map. The goal for doing that is that you then get to attack them again in a later impulse and maybe destroy them. So the choice is shattered so that you don't see them at all for the rest of the turn, but you will see them again next turn, or to retreat them so they're going to stay on the map and be in your way, but they are more vulnerable and perhaps they can be destroyed completely. The retreating of units is done by the phasing side. He decides where all the enemy units retreat, and then he gets to decide whether he wants to advance any of his units into the hex that was just attacked. If there are armored mechanized units in the combat and it was a blitzkrieg and the result was a B result, then the phasing side gets to advance a second hex, and advancing that second hex might cause an overrun to occur. This is the last stage of the impulse. You can rebase your air units, which enables you to move them forward if you're attacking, or move them to the rear if you're defending, or just reassign them to a different theater of operations if they have enough range and you have changing importance as to where you want them to be placed. Reorganization is very limited. You have the ability to reorganize from the air using an air transport that is still available, or with a headquarters that is still organized, or with a naval transport that is still organized and at sea. There are usually 4 or 5 points available for this, so you can choose 4 or 5 units out of your entire armed forces that you reorganize. And then there's the impulse check to see if the turn is over or whether you go to the next impulse. When the turn finishes, there are a long series of phases. These only occur at the end of each turn, and sometimes they do not occur at all, either because of the way the map has been set up or because of the optional rules you've chosen. Partisans are an optional rule, for instance, and if they arrive, they can be placed right on a disorganized enemy air unit, and that could cause the air unit to be overrun, and if it was disorganized, it's destroyed. If it were organized, then it has to rebase. The add and move pack markers is related to neutrality packs. For instance, the USSR and Germany have a neutrality pack at the beginning of the war, and they add markers to their side. There are special rules related to the neutrality packs. There are U.S. entry markers, which is what USE stands for, U.S. entry. And the U.S. entry progresses to get more and more upset and more likely to enter the war. They also have the options, the U.S. player does, has the option of choosing various actions which will have a political consequence. For instance, they can cut off their oil to Japan. Production planning is the next phase. This is where you decide where you're going to send your resources to what factories and whether you're going to save oil points. The production planning also enables you to figure out how you're going to ship those resources overseas or by rail and get them from the resource hex to the factory hex. Once you've figured that out, then you're ready to go on to the next phase where you have some units stay at sea or return to base. The purpose behind having them stay at sea is that they might be able to intercept enemy units that are returning to base. Or you might want them to be at sea in order to guarantee that the convoys that you have out at sea are going to be protected at the very first impulse of the next turn, even if you're not the phasing side. The next phase is final reorganization, where units that have been disorganized become reorganized. That's pretty automatic unless you're using oil. If you're using the optional rule oil, then there need to be oil points available to expend on reorganizing, say, naval units or armored units. After the final reorganization phase, you have the option of breaking down your corps and army, taking some of your corps and making them 2 divisions. This will give you more flexibility, though it definitely weakens the overall strength of the units. Here's part 2 of the end of turn phases. Naval repair and production are the same. The naval repair only occurs during Guadalcanal, and it's a very stripped down version of production. In most scenarios you won't see naval repair at all. Instead you'll just do a full production phase. The production phase you route your resources. Essentially the computer calculates what goes where. You also have to fulfill any lend-lease agreements that you've made for resource points and build points. You then build your units, and if you haven't used up all your oil and build points, you get to save them and place them on the map. Once production is done, you reform your units, which is the opposite of breaking them down. If you have 2 divisions and they meet the requisite requirements, then they can be reformed back into a corps or an army. The intelligence phase is an optional rule, and I won't discuss it here. The last of the end of turn phases are conquest and peace, which has Ukraine declaration. That's an optional rule for forming a minor country out of the Ukraine. Conquest, which is quite important. Conquest occurs whenever you capture the capital, usually the capital and all the factories of a minor country or a major power. There's also conquest of territorials. The rules for this are fairly detailed, and I won't go into them here. But conquest can result in large masses of territory being converted from one side to the other, and entire groups of units being removed from the game because the country has been conquered. Allied minor support is the ability of the allied nations supporting a minor. For instance, Belgium was supported by the Commonwealth and France, and because they did that, that has an effect on the U.S. entry. Mutual peace occurs rarely. Historically, it occurred between the USSR and Japan. They agreed to more or less sign a neutrality pact. Mutual peace might also occur if in the middle of the combat the 2 sides decide we've had enough of this and we just want to have a peace. The reason that the USSR and Japan might settle on a mutual peace is because they have major concerns elsewhere. The USSR is concerned with Germany, and Japan is concerned with China and the US. Vichy Declaration is the option that the Axis has when they conquer Paris to declare Vichy and form a Vichy France small government. There's Liberation, where a conquered country has its capital retaken. Paris, for instance, was liberated. Another example is Ethiopia, where Italy had conquered it and the Commonwealth liberated it later. Surrender is rarely used. It's when one country decides that things are really bad and they don't want to continue fighting and they just surrender. This occurs for major powers. The rest of the side continues fighting, so it doesn't end the war, but it just takes one of the weakest countries out of the decision-making mix. After conquest and peace, there's factory destruction, and this just means that if you have some units on enemy factories, you can decide that they are destroyed. There's a check to see if anybody has won an automatic victory. If not, you go back to the next turn or the end of game. And that concludes the sequence of play. It also concludes Chapter 4 of the training video.